Oh boy, here we go. Jay Powell talking again. We just had the press conference notes posted from Jay Powell. If it becomes appropriate to tighten policy further, we will not hesitate, is what the statement says. Jerome Powell will be presenting that in just a moment on a panel. We will continue to move carefully. We're going to decide meeting by meeting what we're going to do. We've already heard a lot of this. This is not a surprise. Let's see. Attentive to risks that stronger growth could undermine inflation progress. This is all at this conference that's getting started
many
here.
Decades.
Sure. Hear that? All right.
Number of additional.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so good. We got that. So we'll be covering this in just a moment. But again, I'm going through some of Jay Powell's testimony that's already been published. Let's see here. Inflation progress, but still a long way to go. Labor market remains tight, but moving into better balance. Greater share of progress on inflation ahead may come from tight monetary policy, not just a supply side improvement. This is the stuff we've heard them talk about before. Again, none of that really surprising. So very consistent messaging here from Jay Powell. Now just sort of trying to understand, hey, when are we going to get, or what are we going to get out of the Q&A here? So let's see. Fed will begin next framework review latter half of 2024. Maybe that's when we'll get flexible average inflation targeting. Who knows? But anyway, let's listen in over here and see what we got at the event.
And this panel will aim to shed some light on the trade-offs and the challenges that policymakers face today.
Oh, whoops. Oh, stop that. Don't auto move that. What are you doing? Go. Oh, gosh. Sorry. Hold on 1 second. Sound. Sometimes Mac thinks they're monetary policy.
So I'm going to introduce them briefly in the order in which they will speak. We'll start first with Jay Powell. We're very fortunate to have Jay with us. Jay is chairman of the Federal Reserve System since 2018. Arguably, many would say the most powerful policymaker in the world. He served as a member of the Board of Governors since 2012. Prior to the Federal Reserve Board, Jay worked in investment banking. He also served as Undersecretary of Treasury for Domestic Finance in George W. Bush. As governor of the Bank of Israel since 2018, that is for almost as long as Jay's tenure as chairman of the Fed. Before that, Amir was professor of banking and finance at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's a world-renowned expert in macroeconomics, monetary economics, finance, and financial economics, and we're particularly delighted to have Amir with us today. Geeta Gopinath requires no introductions, I think, especially in these walls, but she is the first deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Previously, Geeta had my job as chief economist and head of the research department. And prior to joining the IMF, she was the John Swanstra Professor of International Studies and of Economics at Harvard Universities, with a world-class record of research on exchange rates, trade, and investment, international financial crisis, monetary policy, debt, emerging market crisis, a very, very long and distinguished list. And then last but obviously not least, Ken Rogoff. Ken is the motivation for this year's annual research conference in his honor. And we're very happy to have him today and tomorrow. And currently, the Moritz Boas books, and of course, many, many research articles on debt and financial crisis. He has written what remains to this day a reference textbook, graduate textbook in international macroeconomics with Ken Rogoff in 1996. He's known for, with Maury Upsveld in 1996, is known for his pioneering work on exchange rates, central bank independence, sovereign debt, financial crisis, among many other topics. And Ken has long ranked among the most cited economists. I checked quickly, and I think his REPEC ranking, which is something us for academics or former academics, we check carefully very often. I think his REPEC ranking is number 11, which is totally astonishing. And his Google Scholar count is, off the charts, astronomical. And for those of you who don't know, I have to mention this, Ken is also an international chess grandmaster. Now, we will start with short interventions from each of the panelists for about 10, 12 minutes, followed by a quick discussion between them, and then we will open for discussion with the audience. There are mics in the aisles. If you're at the point at which we reached that stage in the panel, if you want to ask a question, please line up behind the mics, and then you will have a chance to do that. I will only ask that, since our time is counted, that you keep your questions brief, and you also keep them focused on the topic of the panel, which is monetary policy challenges for the global economy. Now, with this, let's start with Jay. I believe Jay will talk about the nature of the inflation process in the US and the appropriateness of the monetary policy response. It's up to you, Jay.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Olivier. It's great to be here, particularly in honor of Ken, whom we're proud to count as a member of the Fed family. So my assigned topic is U.S. monetary policy in the current global inflation episode. So I'll begin by briefly addressing the U.S. outlook, and then I'll turn to three broader questions raised by the historic events of the pandemic era.
All right.
So to begin, U.S. inflation has come down over the past year, but remains well above our 2% target. My colleagues and I are, of course, gratified by this progress, but we expect that the process of getting inflation sustainably down to 2% has a long way to go. The labor market remains tight, although improvements in labor supply and a gradual easing in demand continue to move it into better balance. GDP growth in the third quarter was quite strong, but like most forecasters, we expect growth to moderate in coming quarters. Of course.
Jerome Powell, by refusing to treat climate change like
Oh, no.
Okay. Thank you.
You are putting us at
Thank you very much.
economic disaster.
Thank you very much.
Climate change
Yep.
will threaten.
Thank you. Just close the fucking door. Close the door.
Who just said that? Did you hear that? Somebody's like, just close the effing door. Was that J Pow? Did J Pow say that? What? Did what? No, we didn't. Wait, play that back. Well,
Just close the fucking door. Close the door.
that was J Pow. Listen.
Thank you. Just close the fucking door. Close the door.
No way. Dude, J Pow's a G. Let's go. Oh my God. Dude, no way. Okay, well, we're gonna wait for this. Oh my God, we need to like clip that. That's hilarious. Hold on. Let's clip that really quick because that's so funny. Hold on, where is it? We're waiting for us obviously to come back here. Let's replay that while we wait for this event to happen. So, okay, as J Pow is speaking about inflation, climate change protesters start screaming. Listen to this, and then listen to J Pow say, "Close the freaking door," like a G.
Forecasters, we expect growth to moderate in coming quarters. Of course.
Jerome Powell, by refusing to treat climate change like a systemic
Okay,
risk,
thank you.
You are putting us at
Thank you very
risk of
much.
economic disaster.
Thank you very much.
Climate change
Yep.
will threaten.
Thank you. Just close the fucking door. Close the door.
Oh, wow. So now we're sitting here waiting for Jerome Powell to come back and continue his speech. But I have to say, that was crazy. Just hearing J Pow, total top G mode, just close the door. Oh, Mike, hot mic moment? Yikes. Okay, well, let's wait for this event to continue here. This is crazy, though. I mean, this happened the last time as well, where people were screaming, and the last time Jerome Powell was going to speak, there was a delay like this. We're waiting for the event to come back, but obviously it's disrupted now. So let's stand by here. Okay. All right. Waiting. Looks like I'm trying to get an update on when he's going to come back on. Should be within the next few minutes here. This raises the questions about Fed security. Yep. Yep. So they're saying, the reporters who are in the room right now are saying that someone on the feed was clearly extremely upset, calling for the door to be closed. Yeah, it was a little more than that. Oh, rip. I'm going to tweet that clip. If y'all want to see that or to retweet that, it's going to be up in about, I don't know, 30 seconds here. Jerome Powell just responded to climate protesters with just close the king door on hot mic. Wow. Okay. It's posted. There you go. We're still waiting for the event to continue here. Okay, as noted last time, this raises the questions about Fed security. Microphones picked up the exchange, and it's clear there was frustration. Someone on the feed was extremely upset.
Climate issues
Here we go.
are important, and they're appropriately addressed. But as I mentioned, we'll try to keep the questions on the topic for today. Okay. So, monetary policy challenges for the global economy. Thank you.
Where's J-Pow?
And yeah. No, I don't. Hold on. Let me check. We might have to go to.
I love the hot mic here. Dude, J-Pow bailed. I think he's like, screw you guys. The security sucks. Okay. There we go.
Not at all. No, don't worry about it. Okay, where was I? Inflation was coming down. The labor market remains tight, although improvements in labor supply and a gradual easing in demand continue to move it into better balance. GDP growth in the third quarter was quite strong, but like most forecasters, we do expect growth to moderate in coming quarters. Of course, that remains to be seen, and we are attentive to the risk that stronger growth could undermine further progress in restoring balance to the labor market and in bringing inflation down, which could warrant a response from monetary policy. The FOMC is committed to achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. We are not confident that we've achieved such a stance. We know that ongoing progress toward our 2% goal is not assured. Inflation has given us a few head fakes along the way. If it becomes appropriate to tighten policy further, we will not hesitate to do so. We will continue to move carefully, however, allowing us to address both the risk of being misled by a few good months of data and the risk of over-tightening. We're making decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity, inflation as well as the balance of risks, as we determine the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time. And we'll keep at it until the job is done. So with that, let me turn to the three questions that I've posed that have arisen from the receding but still elevated inflation we're experiencing today. The first question is, with the benefit of 2.5 years to look back, what we can say about the initial causes and ongoing policy implications of the current inflation. After running below our 2% target over the first year of the pandemic, core PCE inflation rose sharply in March 21. Economic forecasters generally did not see this coming, as shown by the February 21 survey of professional forecasters, which showed core PCE running at or below target over the subsequent 3 years. So the real-time policy questions for policymakers were what caused the high inflation and how policy should react. And at the outset, many forecasters and analysts, including FOMC participants, viewed the sudden upturn in inflation as mostly a function of pandemic-related shifts in the composition of demand, a disruption of supply chains, and a sharp decline in labor supply. The resulting supply and demand imbalances led to large increases in the prices of a range of items most directly affected by the pandemic, especially goods. In this view, as the pandemic abated, our dynamic and flexible economy was likely to adapt fairly quickly. Supply disruptions and shortages would diminish, labor supply would rebound, aided by the arrival of vaccines and the reopening of schools, elevated demand for goods would shift back to services, inflation would ease reasonably quickly without the need for significant policy response. Indeed, although monthly core PCE inflation spiked in March and April of 21, beginning in May, it declined for 5 consecutive months, providing some support for this view. But, of course, in the fourth quarter of 21, the data clearly changed amid waves of new COVID-19 variants, with only gradual process in restoring global supply chains and relatively few workers rejoining the labor force. That lack of progress, combined with very strong demand from households, contributed to a tight economy and a historically tight labor market and more persistent high inflation. The committee signaled a change in our policy approach and financial conditions began to tighten. Of course, a new shock arrived in February of 22 when Russia invaded Ukraine, driving up prices of energy and other commodity prices. By the time we lifted off in March, it was clear that bringing down inflation would depend both on the unwinding of the unprecedented pandemic-related demand and supply distortions, and on our tightening of monetary policy, which would slow the growth of aggregate demand, allow supply time to catch up. Today, these two processes are working together to bring inflation down. The FOMC has raised the federal funds rate target by 5.25 percentage points, and we've reduced our securities holdings by more than $1 trillion. Monetary policy is in restrictive territory and putting downward pressure on demand and inflation. The unwinding of pandemic-related supply and demand distortions is playing an important role in the decline in inflation. For example, wage growth has steadily fallen since mid-2022 by most measures, despite continued robust job gains, reflecting a resurgence in labor supply, thanks both to higher labor force participation and a return of immigration to pre-pandemic levels. While the broader supply recovery continues, it's not clear how much more will be achieved by additional supply-side improvements. Going forward, it may be that a greater share of the progress in reducing inflation will have to come from tight monetary policy, restraining the growth of aggregate demand. Turning then to my second question. For many years, it has generally been thought that monetary policy should limit its response to or look through supply shocks to the extent that they are expected to be temporary and idiosyncratic. Many argue as well that in the future, supply disruptions are likely to be more frequent or more persistent than in the decades just before the pandemic. A second question then is what we've learned about this standard looking through approach. The idea that the response to the inflationary effects of supply shocks should be attenuated arises in part from the trade-off presented by those shocks. Supply shocks tend to move prices and employment in opposite directions, whereas monetary policy pushes each in the same direction. Therefore, the response of monetary policy to higher prices stemming from an adverse supply shock should be attenuated because it would otherwise amplify the unwanted decline in employment. In addition, supply shocks have most frequently come from the volatile food and energy categories, and they've passed through quickly. While food and energy prices critically affect the budgets of households and businesses, the policy tools of central banks work more slowly than commodity markets move. So responding aggressively to quickly passing price increases could exacerbate macroeconomic volatility without supporting price stability. Our experience since 2020 highlights some limits of this thinking. To begin with, it can be challenging to disentangle supply shocks from demand shocks in real time, and also to determine how long either will persist, particularly in the extraordinary circumstances of the past 3 years. Supply shocks that have a persistent effect on potential output could call for restrictive policy to better align aggregate demand with the suppressed level of aggregate supply. The sequence of shocks to global supply chains experienced from 2020 to 22 suppressed output for a considerable time and actually may have persistently altered global supply dynamics. Such a sequence calls on policymakers to use policy restraint to limit inflationary effects. Policy restraint in this case is also good risk management. Supply shocks that drive inflation high enough for long enough can affect the longer-term inflation expectations of households and businesses. Monetary policy must forthrightly address any risks of a potential de-anchoring of inflation expectations, as well-anchored expectations help bring inflation back to our target. The sharp policy tightening during 2022 likely contributed to keeping inflation expectations well anchored. My third question, then, is the level where interest rates will settle once the effects of the pandemic are truly behind us. By 2019, the general level of nominal interest rates had declined steadily over several decades. As the pandemic arrived, many advanced economies had below target inflation and low or mildly negative rates, raising difficult questions about the efficacy of interest rate policy when constrained by the effective lower bound, or the ELB, as we call it. Over 2 decades, an extensive literature had identified a number of possible changes to the widely used inflation targeting regime, including negative policy rates, nominal income targeting, and various forms of makeup strategies, under which persistent shortfalls in inflation would be followed by a period of inflation running moderately above 2%. Today, inflation and policy rates are elevated, and the effective lower bound is not currently relevant for our policy decisions. But it's far too soon to say whether the monetary policy challenges of the ELB will ultimately turn out to be a thing of the past. The prolonged proximity of interest rates to the ELB was at the heart of the monetary policy review and the changes we made to our framework in 2020. We will begin our next 5-year review in the latter half of 2024 and announce the results about a year later. Among the questions we will consider is the degree to which the structural features of the economy that led to low interest rates in the pre-pandemic period will persist. With time, we will continue to learn from the experience of the past few years and what implications it may hold for monetary policy. These are just 3 of the many questions raised by these challenging times, and of course, we're very far from a complete understanding of the answers. Again, it's great to be here today, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
He seems a little shaken, honestly. I think he's like pissed, shell-shocked at this second time now.
Jay, and I think we're really off to an excellent start with your remarks. Let me now turn to Amir. Amir, Israel is a small open economy, faces very specific challenges. Like the US and many other countries, it's seen an increase in inflation in recent years, and the Bank of Israel has been acting on it. In addition, like other small open economies, it faces potential spillovers from monetary policy decisions taken elsewhere by major central banks, with a potential impact on currency and capital flows. And we'd love to hear your views. So, Amir, floor is yours.
All right. First, it's a pleasure to be here in a conference in honor of Ken Rogoff. We all cherish and follow his distinguished contribution in academia and practice. Sort of in a sharp turn, as we're all aware, Israel is currently at a war following the October 7th inhuman brutal attack by the terrorist organization of Hamas. This is a crucial time for Israel's security, and we thank all those who support us. Our hearts are with the innocent victims of the war, and our hope is for it to end with a safe return of hostages and with peace and security. And now I'm going to turn now to address the issues and questions presented for this session. An important question is, To what extent can a small open economy like Israel, or for that matter, any SOE, conduct its monetary policy independently, or should it rather follow the steps of the major economies? Another question is, what are the spillovers from the policy taken by the major economies to small open economies, and how do those impact local conditions? The answer to these questions depends on the development of the economy, its specific areas of exposure to the global economy, and the particular
Okay,
shock.
just to give you a heads up, this is a three-person panel, basically. You have the IMF first deputy managing director, you've got Jerome Powell, and then you've got Ken Rogoff, and then now you've got the governor of the Bank of Israel. Okay, so 4 panelists technically in total. This is a panel that is expected to be a 2 to 3:30 p.m. event schedule. We're at 2:30 right now, so the panel goes on for another hour here. And there is expected to be a Q&A segment with J. Powell. So stay tuned for that. For now, we can listen to some of the Bank of Israel here and maybe see how quickly these go so we can get to Q&A.
Monetary policy was generally similar in many countries because the initial health shocks, as well as many supply-side difficulties, were similar. Also, we benefited to some extent from the common monetary framework, such as inflation targeting. And that meant that monetary policy in different economies was predicted to act in a similar manner. Having said that, the differential health shock and related steps, fiscal policy differences, and exposure to supply side effects and commodity prices led to somewhat different policies, consequent inflation, and activity outcomes. Consequently, there was more heterogeneity in monetary policy exiting COVID than upon its entry. Israel was fortunate.
Well, while Israel talks, should we listen to the Elon pod that came out?
Tech sector, which actually benefited from the increased dependency on remote work. These circumstances led to a wedge between global monetary policy and the required domestic monetary policy.
I kind of feel bad because I do think that most people aren't going to really listen to anybody but J. Powell here. So I think we'll wait for the Q&A, although I wonder when the Q&A is going to begin. We'll come back to the Q&A. Let's go jump on over and let's start reacting to podcast here. And here we go. So, but it's 2 hours long. How are we going to segment this? Oh, well, just do it. Well, okay, I'll change the title really quick. Jerome Powell speaks live with Q&A and Elon Musk pod viewing. There. How about that? We'll do that. Okay. All right, give me 1 second. We'll get started. And then we will keep an eye on when they're going to be done. Okay, so let's listen to this, and I'll keep an eye on when they are done. Okay, so let's listen to this.
QE.
Oh, yeah. It would help if I didn't have both audio feeds going at once. I would fix. All right. So Elon's new pod here dropped, comes right after Joe Rogan's. So let's listen to this a little bit while we wait. All right.
I thought you were going to finish it. It's one of the greatest themes in all of film history.
Yeah, that's great.
So I was just thinking about the Roman Empire, as one does.
No.
There's that whole meme where guys are talking about the Roman Empire at least once a day.
And half the population is confused whether it's true or not. But more seriously, thinking about the wars going on in the world today. And as you know, war and military conquest has been a big part of Roman society and culture. And it I think has been a big part of most empires and dynasties throughout human history. So
They usually came as a result of conquest. I mean, there's some like the Austro-Hungarian Empire where there was just a lot of sort of clever marriages.
But fundamentally, there's an engine of conquest. And they celebrate
always.
excellence in warfare. Many of the leaders were excellent generals. That kind of thing. So, big picture question. Grok approved. I asked if this is a good question to ask.
Kid tested, Grok approved.
Yeah. At least on fun mode. To what degree do you think war is part of human nature versus a consequence of how human societies are structured? I ask this as you have somehow controversially been a proponent of peace.
I'm generally a proponent of peace. I mean, ignorance is perhaps, in my view, the real enemy to be countered. That's the real hard part, not, fighting other humans. But all creatures fight. I mean, the jungle is you look at people think of this nature as perhaps some sort of peaceful thing, but in fact, it is not. There's some quite funny Werner Herzog thing where he's like in the jungle, like saying that it's like basically just murder and death in every direction. I mean, the plants and animals in the jungle are constantly trying to kill and eat each other every single day, every minute. So it's not like, we're unusual in that respect.
Well, there's a relevant.
We're going to hop around a little bit. They do have the timestamps on it. So war and human nature. I do want to hear, because Elon didn't talk about the Israel-Hamas war, which is where we're going to jump to. So we're going to hop around a little bit and we'll add some commentary. Let's listen to what they say about Israel and Hamas.
So, like I said, somehow controversially, you've been a proponent of peace on Twitter, on X.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about the wars going on today and to see what the path to peace could be. How do you hope the current war in Israel and Gaza comes to an end? What path do you see that can minimize human suffering in the long term in
Great
that
question.
part of the world?
Well, I think that part of the world is definitely like if you look up there is no easy answer in the dictionary. It'll be that like the picture of the Middle East, in Israel especially. So there is no easy answer. What this is strictly my opinion of is that the goal of Hamas was to provoke an overreaction from Israel. They obviously do not expect to, have a military victory, but they really wanted to commit the worst atrocities that they could in order to provoke the most aggressive response possible from Israel, and then leverage that aggressive response to rally Muslims worldwide for the cause of Gaza and Palestine, which they have succeeded in doing. So the counterintuitive thing here, I think that the thing that I think should be done, even though it is very difficult.
I do want to say quick, I think Elon's spot on about this. I mean, Hamas has succeeded in accelerating that sort of hate bucket, so to speak, of whether it's anti-Jew or anti-Muslim on both sides. The tensions have flared substantially because of this.
Is that I would recommend that Israel engage in the most conspicuous acts of kindness possible. Everything. That is the actual thing that would thwart the goal of Hamas.
So, in some sense, the degree that makes sense in geopolitics, turn the other cheek, implemented.
It's not exactly turn the other cheek, because I do think that there's, I think it is appropriate for Israel to find the Hamas members and, either kill them or incarcerate them. Like that's something has to be done because they're just going to keep coming otherwise. But
true.
In addition to that, they need to do whatever they can. There's some talk of establishing, for example, a mobile hospital. I'd recommend doing that. Just making sure that there's food, water, medical necessities, and just be over the top about it and be very transparent. So people can't claim it's a trick. Like just put a webcam on the thing, all 24/7.
Deploy acts of kindness.
Yeah, conspicuous acts of kindness that are unequivocal, meaning they can't be somehow, because Hamas will then their response will be, oh, it's a trick. Therefore, you have to counter how is it not a trick.
This ultimately fights the broader force of hatred in the region.
Yes, and I'm not sure who said it. It's an apocryphal saying, but an eye for an eye makes everyone blind.
Yeah.
Now that neck of the woods, they really
Gandhi quote. That's a big famous one.
believe in the whole eye for an eye thing. But I mean, you really have, if you're not going to just outright commit genocide, like against an entire people, which obviously would not be acceptable to really shouldn't be acceptable to anyone, then you're going to leave basically a lot of people alive who subsequently, hate Israel. So really the question is like, how, for every Hamas member that you kill, how many did you create?
Mm-hmm.
And if you create more than you killed, you've not succeeded. That's the real situation there. And it's safe to say that if you kill somebody's child in Gaza, you've made at least a few Hamas members who will die just to kill an Israeli. That's the situation.
Such a good point that I think is understated is that like when somebody loses a child, and I mean, knock on wood, nobody wants to be in that situation, right? But when somebody loses a child, you potentially you no matter who you are, you become radicalized because there's so much anger. And so what Elon's saying here is totally right. You create substantially more hate and anger. 50% of the Palestinian population is children, well, at least in Gaza Strip. Every bomb that goes off is 15 dead. Terrible. Let's keep going here. At least 15. That's just the average, right?
So, but I mean, this is one of the most contentious subjects one could possibly discuss. But I think if the goal ultimately is some sort of long-term peace, one has to look at this from the standpoint of, over time, are there more or fewer terrorists being created?
Let me just linger on war.
Yeah, well, war. It was safe to say wars always existed and always will exist.
Always will exist.
Always has existed and always will exist.
I hope not. You think it always will?
There will always be war.
Wow.
It's a question of just how much war, and what there's this sort of the scope and scale of war,
Mm-hmm.
but to imagine that there would not be any war in the future, I think would be a very unlikely outcome.
Yeah.
I think this is such an interesting argument, this idea that there will always be war. Well, hold on one sec. It looks like we might be going to Q&A. I'm not sure if we're going to another presentation or if we're going to Q&A. Let's listen quickly.
The question in front of us at the front is, how to think about the challenges for central banks and whether central banks have the appropriate toolkit at the current juncture. And I think everyone will be very grateful to hear your views, Gita.
We have another presentation. Okay,
Thank you.
so we'll come back when we get into, again, the Q&A portion. And in the meantime, we will enjoy listening to some more Elon, and we'll bounce back and forth. So that way we're ready when the Q&A starts.
There's war even there.
Yes, this giant war. The first book starts off with a gigantic galactic war where trillions die. Trillions.
But it still nevertheless protects these pockets of flourishing. Somehow you can have galactic war and still have pockets of flourishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I guess if we are able to one day expand to, fill the galaxy or whatever, there will be a galactic war at some point.
The scale. I mean, the scale of war has been increasing. It's like a race between the scale of suffering and the scale of flourishing.
Yes.
A lot of people seem to be using this tragedy to beat the drums of war and feed the military-industrial complex. Do you worry about this? The people who are rooting for escalation, and how can it be stopped?
This is
One of the things
interesting.
that does concern me.
So politically appropriate right now to ask the question, hey, like, is it possible that people like Nikki Haley or DeSantis calling for essentially expanding support for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, more weapons, more weapons, more weapons? Some people argue, okay, have they been bought out by the military industrial complex? Let's listen to the reply here.
Is that there are very few people alive today who actually viscerally understand the horrors of war, at least in the U.S. I mean, obviously, there are people on the front lines in Ukraine and Russia who understand just how terrible war is. But how many people in the West understand it? My grandfather was in World War II. He was severely traumatized. He was there, I think, for almost 6 years in East and North Africa and Italy. All his friends were killed in front of him, and he would have died too, except they randomly gave some, I guess, IQ test or something, and he scored very high. Now, he was not an officer. He was, I think, a corporal or a sergeant or something like that, because he didn't finish high school. He had to drop out of high school because his dad died, and he had to work to support his siblings. So because he didn't graduate high school, he was not eligible for the officer corps. So, he kind of got put into the cannon fodder category, basically. But then randomly they gave him this test. He was transferred to British intelligence in London. That's where he met my grandmother. But he had PTSD next level, like next level. I mean, just didn't talk. And if you tried talking to him, he'd just tell you to shut up. And he won a bunch of medals, never bragged about it once, not even hinted, nothing. I found out about it because his military records are online. That's how I know. So he would say, like, no way in hell. Do you want to do that again? But how many people? He obviously he died, 20 years ago or longer, actually, 30 years ago. How many people are alive that remember World War II? Not many.
And the same perhaps applies to the threat of nuclear war.
Yeah, I mean, there are enough nuclear bombs pointed at the United States to make the radioactive rubble bounce many times.
There's two major wars going on right now. So you talked about the threat of AGI quite a bit, but now, as we sit here with the intensity of conflict going on, do you worry about nuclear war?
I think we shouldn't discount the possibility of nuclear
Artificial general intelligence.
war. It is a civilizational threat. Right now, I could be wrong, but I think that the current probability of nuclear war is quite low. But there are a lot of nukes pointed at us. And we have a lot of nukes pointed at other people. They're still there.
Was the principle of mutually assured destruction. And I think Elon has a good point here that the odds are probably relatively low. You get a lot of saber rattling from like Iran or North Korea, but they can't get their rockets up. And then, of course, you have Russia that realizes they'd just be deleted if there was any kind of actual nuclear provocation. So it's not worth it when America is so ridiculously powerful. But he's not wrong.
There, nobody's put their guns away. The missiles are still in the silos.
And the leaders don't seem to be the ones with the nukes talking to each other.
No. There are wars which are tragic and difficult on a local basis, and then there are wars which are civilization ending or have that potential. Obviously, global thermonuclear warfare has high potential to end civilization, perhaps permanently, but certainly, to severely wound and perhaps set back human progress by to the Stone Age or something. I don't know. Pretty bad. probably scientists and engineers want to be super popular after that as well. They're like, you got us into this mess. So generally, I think we obviously want to prioritize civilizational risks over things that are painful and tragic on a local level, but not civilizational.
How do you hope the war in Ukraine comes to an end? And what's the path, once again, to minimizing human suffering there?
Well, I think that what is likely to happen, which is really pretty much the way it is that something very close to the current lines will be how a ceasefire or truce happens. But you just have a situation right now where whoever goes on the offensive will suffer casualties at several times the rate of whoever's on the defense. Because you've got defense in depth, you've got minefields, trenches, anti-tank defenses. Nobody has air superiority because the anti-aircraft missiles are really far better than the aircraft. Like, there are far more of them. And so neither side has air superiority. Tanks are basically death traps, just slow moving, and they're not immune to anti-tank weapons. So you really just have long range artillery and infantry trenches. It's World War I all over again.
Wow.
With drones, throwing little drones, some drones there.
What a crazy reference that this is a return to World War I with drones, dropping grenades, basically. That's crazy. What a wild reference. Trench warfare.
Which makes the long-range artillery just that much more accurate and better, and so more efficient at murdering people on both sides.
Yeah. So it's whoever is, you don't want to be trying to advance from either side, because the probability of dying is incredibly high. So in order to overcome defense in depth trenches and minefields, you really need significant local superiority in numbers. Ideally combined arms, where you do a fast attack with aircraft, a concentrated number of tanks, and a lot of people. That's the only way you're going to punch through a line. And then you're going to punch through and then not have reinforcements just kick you right out again. I mean, I really recommend people read World War I warfare in detail. It's rough. I mean, the sheer number of people that died there was mind-boggling.
And it's almost impossible to imagine the end of it that doesn't look like almost exactly like the beginning, in terms of what land belongs to who and so on. But on the other side of a lot of human suffering, death, and destruction of infrastructure.
Yes. I mean, the thing that the reason I proposed some sort of truce or peace a year ago was because I predicted pretty much exactly what would happen, which is a lot of people dying for basically almost no changes in land, and the loss of the flower of Ukrainian and Russian youth. And we should have some sympathy for the Russian boys as well as the Ukrainian boys, because the Russian boys didn't ask to be on the front line; they have to be. So there's a lot of sons not coming back to their parents, and I think most of them don't really they don't hate the other side. It's sort of like, there's this saying about, like, this saying comes from World War I. It's like young boys who don't know each other killing each other on behalf of old men that do know each other. The hell's the point of that?
This is something that Elon has argued many times in podcasts before, that you're really destroying the younger generation here. And I think this is eloquently put when he says, hey, you're fighting an old person's, mostly an old man's battle. And most people don't hate each other. I agree with him. I think 80+% of humans, maybe hopefully optimistically 90+% of people don't hate each other. Everybody just, wants to build their own success and enjoy life, right? It's sad.
So Volodymyr Zelensky said that he's not, or has said in the past, he's not interested in talking to Putin directly. Do you think he should sit down, man to man, leader to leader, and negotiate peace?
Look, I think I would just recommend do not send the flower of Ukrainian youth to die in trenches. Whether he talks to Putin or not, just don't do that. Whoever goes on the offensive will lose massive numbers of people. And history will not look kindly upon them.
You've spoken honestly about the possibility of war between U.S. and China in the long term, if no diplomatic solution is found. For example, on the question of Taiwan and one China policy.
Right.
How do we avoid the trajectory where these two superpowers clash?
Well, it's worth reading that book on the difficult to pronounce Thucydides trap, I believe it's called. I love war history. I like inside out and backwards. There's hardly a battle I haven't read about. And trying to figure out like what really was the cause of victory in any particular case, as opposed to what one side or another claims the reason.
Both the victory and what sparked the war, and
the
whole thing.
Yeah. So that Athens and Sparta is a classic case. The thing about the Greeks is they really wrote down a lot of stuff. They loved writing. There are lots of interesting things that happened in many parts of the world, but people just didn't write down. So we don't know what happened, or they didn't really write in detail. They just would say like, we had a battle and we won. And like, well, what? Can you add a bit more? The Greeks, they really wrote a lot. They were very articulate on it. They just love writing. So, and we have a bunch of that writing that's preserved. So we know what led up to the Peloponnesian War between the Spartan and Athenian alliance. And we know that they saw it coming. I mean, the Spartans didn't write. They also weren't very verbose by their nature.
I think we're potentially getting to Q&A. I'm not sure. We're going to check in just a moment with J. Powell. Do keep in mind, just to add some context here, Thucydides' trap is basically this idea that when a rising power challenges a new or an existing power, the most likely outcome is war. That's essentially what Elon said, just going a little bit deeper, that rather than war being the exception, war becomes the norm in any kind of challenging environment where a rising power wants to take down an established one. And this is you could think even more recently to think about the American Revolution versus the English. The British are coming. It's very interesting because eventually you have war, as we did. I think War of 1812. It wasn't just the Revolutionary Wars, the War of 1812. And so war becomes a norm until there's some kind of new equilibrium. And then America became the dominant superpower. And so Elon here is making the argument that we could be trending to war with China the more this challenge between China and America continues. But it's also unclear, is China truly challenging the United States? And of course, in many regards, they are. Artificial intelligence, chip manufacturing, raw materials, sanctions. So we'll see. All right, let's listen in for a moment here just to see what we're going to get from Rogoff, and then we'll go back to Elon.
Shifts in U.S. policy from one president to the next, and the various implications of that. The pandemic, war in Ukraine, now war in the Middle East. And this really fragmentation of globalization is really something extraordinary and is a very difficult period. I think that has implications for a lot of things, for policy, for macroeconomics. However, before I get into that, I want to say, I can think of, there is sort of one silver lining, and I must hesitate to say it because if I'm identifying something the IMF seems to have done right, then it may immediately go wrong.
Okay, I'm going to pull off of this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a heads up if you know what he says. I've got a live feed going of what Rogoff says here. Let's keep listening to Elon while we wait for Q&A. Q&A is supposed to end in 35 minutes, and it hasn't even started yet. So hopefully Rogoff keeps it short here. But let's keep going with Elon for the time being. And I'll give you updates on what Rogoff says as he goes through it, and I'll keep an eye on it as well. So jumping into Elon.
But they did right, but they weren't very, yeah, they were terse. But the Athenians and the other Greeks wrote a line, and they were like, and Sparta was really kind of like the leader of Greece. But Athens grew stronger and stronger with each passing year. And everyone's like, well, that's inevitable that there's going to be a clash between Athens and Sparta. Well, how do we avoid that? And they saw it coming, and they still could not avoid it. So, you know, at some point, if one group, one civilization or country or whatever exceeds another, sort of like if, you know, the United States has been the biggest kid on the block since I think around 1890 from an economic standpoint. So the United States has been the most powerful economic engine in the world longer than anyone's been alive. And the foundation of war is economics. So now we have a situation in the case of China where the economy is likely to be 2, perhaps 3 times larger than that of the U.S. So imagine you're the biggest kid on the block for as long as anyone can remember, and suddenly a kid comes along who's twice your size.
So we see it coming.
Yeah.
How is it possible to stop? Is there some, let me throw something out there, just intermixing of cultures, understanding? There does seem to be a giant cultural gap in understanding of each other. And you're an interesting case study because you are an American, obviously. You've done a lot of incredible manufacture here in the United States, but you also work with China.
I've spent a lot of time in China and met with the leadership many times.
Maybe a good question to ask is, what are some things about China that people don't understand, positive, just in the culture? What's some interesting things that you've learned about the Chinese?
Work.
Well, the sheer number of really smart, hardworking people in China is
Let's go.
incredible. There are really, if you say like how many smart, hardworking people are there in China? There's far more of them there than there are here, I think, in my opinion.
Wow.
And they've got a lot of energy. So, I mean, the architecture in China that's in recent years is far more impressive than the U.S. I mean, the train stations, the buildings, the high-speed rail, everything. It's really far more impressive than what we have in the U.S. I mean, I recommend somebody just go to Shanghai and Beijing, look at the buildings, and go to, take the train from Beijing to Xi'an, where you have the terracotta warriors. China's got an incredible history, very long history. And, I think arguably in terms of the use of language from a written standpoint, sort of one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest written language. And in China, people did write things down. So now China historically has always been, with rare exception, been internally focused. They have not been acquisitive. They've fought each other. There have been many, many civil wars. In the Three Kingdoms War, I believe they lost about 70% of their population. So they've had brutal internal wars, like civil wars that make the U.S. Civil War look small by comparison. So I think it's important to appreciate that China is not monolithic. We sort of think of like China as a sort of one entity of one mind, and this is definitely not the case. From what I've seen, and I think
it's good to remember that like not everybody in China is part of the Chinese Communist Party, right? That's just the leadership now. And so I think that's a really good reference actually to think about China as not just the CCP. Good point.
Most people who understand China would agree. People in China think about China 10 times more than they think about anything outside of China.
Quick stat. The CCP has 98 million members. That sounds like a lot of people, right? But they have 1,400 million people living in China. So that means 6.7% of people are part of the CCP. Interesting.
So it's like 90% of their consideration is, is internal.
Well, isn't that a really positive thing when you're talking about the collaboration and a future peace between superpowers? When you're inward facing, which is like focusing on improving yourself versus focusing on, quote unquote, improving others through military might.
But the good news, the history of China suggests that China is not acquisitive, meaning they're not going to go out and invade a whole bunch of countries. Now they do feel very strongly, so that's good. I mean, because a lot of very powerful countries have been acquisitive.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. is also one of the rare cases that has not been acquisitive. Like after World War II, the U.S. could have basically taken over the world and any country. Like we got nukes, nobody else got nukes. We don't even have to lose soldiers. Which country do you want?
Mm-hmm.
And the United States could have taken over everything. At will, and it didn't. And the United States actually helped rebuild countries. So it helped rebuild Europe, helped rebuild Japan. This is very unusual behavior, almost unprecedented. The U.S. did conspicuous acts of kindness, like the Berlin airlift. And I think, it's always like, well, America's done bad things. Well, of course, America's done bad things, but one needs to look at the whole track record. And just generally, one sort of test would be, how do you treat your prisoners of war?
Mm-hmm.
Or let's say, no offense to the Russians, but let's say you're in Germany. It's 1945. You got the Russian army coming on one side. You got the French, British, and American armies coming on the other side. Who would you like to surrender to? Like, no country is like morally perfect, but I recommend being a POW with the Americans. That would be my choice very strongly.
In the full menu of POW.
Very
US.
much so. And in fact, Wernher von Braun took, a smart guy, was like, we've got to be captured by the Americans.
Yep.
And in fact, the SS was.
I'm going to move forward a little bit. We're waiting for JPow's comments. JPow comments start soon. I'm going to jump to the AI segment. So far, I really do like Elon's talk about China. Just in fairness, you could go watch it over at the Lex Pod in full. I'm going to add my commentary in the sections I think are useful, but stay tuned because we have 25 minutes left in the IMF event, which is going on right now. I'm just watching it live right now on this other screen, waiting for JPow to come out. So we should see Q&A within the next 5 minutes here. So let's listen to AI Grook for a bit.
To escape briefly the darkness with some incredible engineering work. XAI just released Grok AI assistant that I've gotten a chance to play with. It's amazing on many levels. First of all, it's amazing that a relatively small team in a relatively short amount of time was able to develop this close to state-of-the-art system. Another incredible thing is there's a regular mode and there's a fun mode.
Yeah, I guess I'm to blame for that one.
First of all, I wish everything in life had a fun mode.
Yeah.
There's something compelling beyond just fun about the fun mode interacting with a large language model. I'm not sure exactly what it is because I've only had a little bit of time to play with it, but it just makes it more interesting, more vibrant to interact with the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Our AI Grok is modeled after the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is one of my favorite books. It's a book on philosophy disguised as a book on humor.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that forms the basis of my philosophy, which is that we don't know the meaning of life, but the more we can expand the scope and scale of consciousness, digital and biological, the more we're able to understand what questions to ask about the answer that is the universe. So I have a philosophy of curiosity.
There is generally a feeling like this AI system has an outward looking, like the way you are, like sitting with a good friend, looking up at the stars, like asking podhead like questions about the universe, wondering what it's all about, the curiosity you talk about. There's a sense, no matter how mundane the question I ask it, there's a sense of cosmic grandeur to the whole thing.
Well, we are actually working hard to have engineering, math, and physics answers that you can count on.
Yeah.
So for the other sort of AIs out there, these so-called large language models, I've not found the engineering to be reliable. And
Okay, so I actually also agree with Elon here. There are a lot of times I'll know 80% of a certain topic, and I'm like, okay, I'm looking for a little bit extra perspective. And so I'm talking to GPT about it, and I'm looking at my knowledge base of the 80% that I'm aware of, whether that's licensing or laws or just historical facts or whatever. And then some of the stuff I'm getting back, I'm like, where the hell did you get that from? So, while I don't use it for math, I can imagine there's definitely some fact checking going into that side as well. So I'm not in disagreement here with Elon on that.
the hallucination, it unfortunately hallucinates most when you least want it to hallucinate.
Yeah, right.
So when you ask important, difficult questions, that's when it tends to be confidently wrong. So we're really trying hard to say, okay, how do we be as grounded as possible so you can count on the results? Trace things back to physics first principles, mathematical logic. So underlying the humor is an aspiration to adhere to the truth of the universe as closely as possible.
That's really tricky.
It is tricky. So that's why, there's always going to be some amount of error, but we want to aspire to be as truthful as possible about the answers with acknowledged error. So that there was always, you don't want to be confidently wrong. So you're not going to be right every time, but you want to minimize how often you're confidently wrong. And then, like I said, once you can count on the logic as being not violating physics.
Okay, hold on. We're going into the Q&A. JPOW Q&A.
As we've seen today, there are some ways in which central banks are asked to do much more than just monetary policy. Let me maybe open it up to the panelists and see if anyone wants to react to the points that have been raised by others before we then take questions from the floor. So anyone wants to? Gita, please.
Amir, if I may, you briefly mentioned about the use of FX intervention. And I said in my speaking points that it's a pretty tricky thing to tell apart when to intervene and when not to. It'd be great to hear from you how you think about that.
I think one lesson that we learned through economic history is that when financial crises intermingle with real crisis or other events, you can think of COVID as a health crisis, went into an economic crisis, and through a lot of the work of the Fed, we sort of averted a financial crisis. But we know those are the deepest, those have a magnifying effect when the two interact. And that's why when this event had started, it was, and we could already see there was a lot of things going on in Asia and other places regarding the shekel. That was the logic. You want to ensure stability. You want to make sure the markets function. You don't target a particular exchange rate, but you want to moderate things such that the markets function, there is liquidity, and that was our goal. And I think, as of now, as I showed you, the exchange rate sort of through events, obviously it's related to the events that are actually happening in Israel as well, but it gave it time. It didn't drift into panic mode, and that was the role of, and still is the role of FX intervention. When you have risk premia go up, that's the number one concern. There are people, when it happened, immediately say you should lower interest rates, help the economy. No, the two go hand in hand together. The idea was to stabilize the exchange rate. The exchange rate stability had periphery effects on the bond market and the stock market in Israel. They continue all to function. We came with the other prong approach with the targeted things for the households, and that was the way we sort of aimed at it.
So if I can, and in the meantime, if you are planning to ask a question, I will ask you to go and put yourself behind one of the mics so we can directly move to the questions afterwards. But before we turn to that, let me actually follow up with one question for, Amir and Jay. Jay, there's this incredible resilience in the U.S. economy that, Gita mentioned. We've had this decline in inflation, and the economy seems to be powering ahead. Growth is really at a very high level. Consumption is very, very strong. There's this question about whether transmission of monetary policy is different this time around. Now, in your remarks, you've alluded to the fact that the sequence of shocks we've had is quite different from the typical business cycle, and so I was curious, and I would like to ask the same question to Amir, because in the context of the tightening of policy that you have done in at the Bank of Israel, and maybe some of these resilience that Ken was talking about, building a stronger monetary policy framework, building reserves, etc., whether there is a sense in which the tightening operates in slightly different ways, there are longer delays, shorter delays. How do you view this from your own vantage point?
Go ahead. So I would say a couple things. Clearly, the U.S. economy has been stronger than expected. It's been more resilient, and this year is just remarkable, really. So many forecasters had a recession this year, and it's nothing like that. It's going to be close to 2.5% growth this year. But that's probably, in my thinking, probably significantly a function of strong demand. I think monetary policy is generally working in the ways that we think it should work, which is interest-sensitive spending, asset prices, exchange rate. I think there are some aspects of the U.S. economy where you can argue that it's a little different, and that would be, for example, households who are in low-rate mortgages are not selling their homes, but they're also not feeling the effects of higher rates because they really don't want to get out of those mortgages. Same thing with companies. Any company that had access to fixed rate borrowing and didn't use that in the last 3 or 4 years would be facing, but there are very few companies that are in that. So it may be that the U.S. economy is structurally a little bit more resilient to interest rates, but I don't think that I don't see at this point anything that seems to be structurally or materially in the nature of a difference.
Amir.
I sort of agree with Jay. I think the famous long lags, it may be a bit longer. Partly people came out of COVID with a lot of savings.
Yeah.
So the potency and the effect of monetary policy took longer, the adjustments of both supply and demand. But I think at least Israel also had, as I shown, a very strong recovery, and we are still above trend, but we're slowing down. So the effect of monetary policy was kicking in before this whole event. Inflation was probably on its way to our target in Q1 24. It just took, in my opinion, a little bit longer for these adjustments to happen. I also agree with Jay in his speech that the issue of supply, to look through supply, was there's a time to do that, but once inflation gets too high and too long, the expectation channel is so important. And as long as that was anchored, in monetary policy ultimately would kick in. It did take a little bit longer.
Okay, Jay.
I just want to, for a second, go back to something that Ken talked about, which is central bank independence. Unsurprisingly, I'm a believer in central bank independence. But it really is just an institutional arrangement that exists because the elected government allows it to exist. And as long as it serves the public well, it's a fine institutional arrangement. And I think it's easy to forget that we have this precious independence. It should be very, very rare in a functioning democracy that you have an institution that has the degree of independence that we have. Of course, we strive all the time to be democratically accountable and transparent. But I think that the temptation to wander into exciting new issues that really are the business of the elected government is a strong one and is to be resisted. And because I think that's when I think of ways that independence could be undermined. To me, that's right at the top of the list.
Very good. Any other reactions or comments?
Well, I would just add to what Jay just said. I mean, I think many economists, particularly over the last 15 or 20 years, just take it for granted, and they have these very sterile technocratic models and don't realize that central bank independence is something central bankers have to fight for every day. I mean, it's a very political environment with which they have to protect their right to do monetary policy independently.
Very good.
Okay.
So let me open it up to the floor. So I'm going to start with Martin here. Please state your name and your affiliation, and then I'll move back and we'll alternate. So Martin, you go first.
So Martin Stürmer with the research department here at the IMF. Governor Yaron, thank you so much for joining us during these terrible times. I hope that you can live in peace very soon. Now, what are the scenarios that you are preparing for? What are the worst case scenarios that you're thinking about?
The projections that we gave, as I mentioned, were contained to a situation where most of the war is really at the southern border. It takes until the end of 2023. It doesn't mean there's no interactions in the war in the north, but there isn't a full-fledged transition into a war there. That's a different ball game. It will have a different impact. There's enough uncertainties even around just the issues of the southern border, just dealing with the southern border, how comfortable people will be coming back to some of the activities around there. The north border will be, if that happens, and we all hope that doesn't happen, this could have a much bigger implication. Is just a different scenario altogether.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the back, the lady over there. It should be working.
Hi, I'm Vivian. I'm an economist here at the IMF. My question would be to Mr. Powell. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that subject that Gita touched upon, which is the recent movements in the yield curve in these last many weeks. And I wanted to know if you think it's a change in natural rates, so maybe Fed funds rate should be a bit higher, or this is just a steeper yield curve, like higher term premium, so maybe Fed funds rates could be lower. And also, I'm a bit worried about over-tightening on a personal level, of course. So what would be clear evidence for you that rates are in restrictive territory enough, given the lags? I mean, we could be over-tightening. That's it.
Thank you. So,
all right, here we go.
Your first question on the implications of higher rates. It's when we move the federal funds rate around, the real point is to affect broader financial conditions, and broader financial conditions then affect the economy, the real economy, in ways that we broadly understand. But So we don't target any one financial condition. We look at broader financial conditions. So it's very hard to draw a direct line from one particular thing like higher bond yields to what monetary policy should do. So the first thing you would look at, though, is you'd look for persistent changes. Even then, and so then the question is, and Gita touched on this appropriately, which is why are longer run rates going up? And it really, the reason they're going up really matters. So we have to factor that in. So it's something we're looking at. We're certainly not going to ignore a significant tightening in financial conditions through that channel, but we don't have to decide. We're moving carefully now. We've moved very fast, and rates are now restrictive, and so we're going to be looking at this question, and not something we're trying to make a decision on right now. In terms of, I take your question to be why are long rates higher? I think there are many candidate explanations, and 5 or 6 of them. It's easy to get to a half dozen explanations. I think we really don't know. I think one thing to point out, though, is people are experiencing these higher rates are actually affecting people's mortgages. The costs of all their floating rate debt is being affected. So it's having an effect on the economy. That the standard thinking has been that this was largely about term premium. Then the question is, why term premium? I don't want to try to dive into all of that today, but it's something we're looking at carefully and just seeing. In terms of you mentioned over tightening, but how are we thinking? So I would just go back at the beginning. Really, the question was to move as fast as we could. As I went through with the chronology, in early 2022, it became obvious that we needed to tighten policy as quickly as we could, and also at a reasonable pace. So we did, and that was the main thing, was speed. The second question was going to be how high to go, and we're still on that question. We're still on the question of a policy stance that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. The next question will be how long to keep rates restrictive. And so we're looking at, there is no magic to it. We're looking at the incoming data, of course, but really we're looking at the implications for the outlook. It's really what are we learning about the outlook, the balance of risks, and all those things. And we're trying to make a judgment at this point whether we need to do more. And as I said, we did move very quickly. The speed is no longer, the main thing. The main thing now is to try to get to that right level. Of course, we don't want to go too far, but at the same time, we know the biggest mistake we could make would be to fail to get inflation under control. So that's not going to happen. We will keep at this until we succeed. So moving carefully and looking at all the evidence and trying to make smart decisions on behalf of the public.
Okay.
Let's go in the front here, sir.
Thank you. I'm Charlie Kimball with the Korea Center for International Finance. Both in the United States and presumably in Israel, in 2020, fiscal policy and monetary policy were in line. And now they seem to be at cross purposes. That is, we have very easy fiscal policy here,
Biden,
presumably in Israel. Does that mean that the real rate of interest that you should aim for should be a little higher?
Amir, do you want to go first?
I think this situation, I'm not sure we're in different situation right now in the U.S. So I think, the job of the government in this kind of an emergency war situation is to supply the needs of many of the people who've gotten hurt from the war, and to try to minimize as much the damage that might be from this event, and that require fiscal spending. There's also, obviously, as Ken mentioned, there's likely to be more military spending over time. And the point that I was alluding to was that we need to find the right balance, where on the one hand, these spending be done, and at the same time go and very carefully find less needed, or especially given the circumstances, items in the budget, and direct them into those spending avenues, such that the fiscal stand over time, and we've demonstrated very responsible fiscal position. And I believe that if we do that, while the debt to GDP of Israel will go up for a while, the fiscal position will retrieve back and fundamentally can avoid structurally changing. But that require to do these appropriate adjustments over time that I mentioned.
So first, the thing to say is that we stay very far away from commenting on fiscal policy, even indirectly. So I won't do that. But I will say the way I'm thinking about this is let's look at where real rates are. So the federal funds rate's at 5.3 and change. If you take a 1 year forward look at inflation, maybe that's 3. So you've got real rates that are above 2%, and that's well above most mainstream estimates of where the neutral rate might be. I think that our star is as a not a particularly useful way to think about policy, because it can be affected by so many things and it changes over the short run and the long run. So I think I tend to look at it that we're in the range, we're in the place where we have restrictive policy, and probably significantly restrictive policy, and we're watching the effect carefully on the economy. I think the question of, has the neutral rate risen or will it rise, and will that be because of this factor or that factor, is less interesting given the policy job that we have to do. Of course, we have all the models and we look at them and things like that, but really I think about it in a more practical way.
Nice.
Final question, sir.
Be good.
Dr. Mamadouba from Howard University and Athletic International University in Hawaii. Actually, the biggest problem in the world economy is inflation. Why the Fed did not change its fundamental goal from unemployment to inflation? If you understand.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, actually, the fundamental goal, the biggest problem in the world economy is inflation. Why the Fed, your bank, did not change its fundamental goal from unemployment to inflation like the ECB?
Great, thank you. So we have a congressionally set mandate of maximum employment and price stability, and those two goals are equal under the law, and we can't change them. Only Congress can do that. We do have a provision. The question is, what if we're very far from one of those goals and not so far from the other? And what we do is when we say this in our constitutional document that we've written, it's not a matter of law, but our policy would be to focus on the one where we're farther away from the actual goal. So 2% inflation, we were a year or so ago very far from 2% inflation, and that has been our focus. As inflation comes back down, it becomes more of an equal weighting thing. And when you're equally far away from each goal, then the two are equal because they are exactly equal under the law.
Thank you. So I want to thank our panelists, but I would like to give a chance to Ken to maybe have a final word, since this whole thing is for you. So
I think people were pretty interested in hearing everybody else in this particular panel. I will say on this last question about fiscal dominance, it's a very different thing when you're at war and fiscal spending's taking up, I don't know the number, but half of GDP suddenly. Defense spending's taking up half of GDP suddenly, and there's no country which looks at its inflation targeting framework exactly there. Nobody does that. I don't think anyone fully did that even in the pandemic. You don't have to comment, but I mean that had a certain war-like feel at the beginning. It's a very different situation where you really need to reach into the toolkit because the national objectives are now very different than just unemployment and inflation.
So please join me and let's thank all our panelists.
All right, fantastic. Okay, let's do some bottom lines here. There are some, not many, but there are some. So let's get started with that. All right, here we go. So what did we just hear from Jerome Powell at the conference where he shouted, quote, just close the effing door as he was interrupted by climate protesters? Well, we heard Jerome Powell say that we have a long way to go, which definitely starts out pretty bearish, especially when he suggests, quote, we don't want to be misled by a few months of data. This started bearish. It's almost like he went in and the other folks at the Fed are like, yo, when you go in today, everybody's going to be watching you, Jay Powell, and you need to say some bearish stuff to balance out what you caused last week. Because last week, you made Treasury yields drop from 4.99 at one point all the way down to 4.5. Okay? Well, today, they spiked right back up after Jerome Powell's initial talk, right nicely to 4.62-ish, right around there, 4.63, 4.64. NASDAQ down, SPY down, Tesla down, NVIDIA down. It's all painful, okay? So this sounds bad. And we heard the general stuff that we've heard before, like, hey, the first part of getting inflation down was the supply chain rebound, which took longer than we thought, more COVID waves than we thought. The second part is going to be having to have sufficiently restrictive monetary policy. Okay, great. We've heard all that before. So what is some of the new stuff that we heard from Jay Powell here? Well, for me, I loved hearing him say, buy Kevin's courses with the price going up Friday. That coupon is juicy and you got to get in before Friday. Go to meetkevin.com to check out all the new Bruce Pro courses. The second thing that I really loved hearing Jay Powell say was, will the neutral rate of interest rise? So Ken Rogoff actually talked about this. I was watching the live, the video, but also the live notes on this. Rogoff thinks that the answer is yes, that the neutral rate of interest is going to go up substantially because of deglobalization and green energy. So green energy, deglobalization, and high spending on defense, 3 factors that could actually leave interest rates higher for the rest of the decade, Ken Rogoff thinks, economist from Harvard. Jerome Powell's response, because Jerome Powell was questioned, hey, well, are you going to raise the R star? You know, does that mean we're going to have a higher neutral rate? Does that mean rates are going to basically have to be higher forever? And Jerome Powell's kind of like, will neutral raise up? Who cares? We have models, but really we're just going to be practical about it. Inflation down, good. Don't have to raise rates more. Jobs stable, we hold stable. Jobs start turning over, we cut. That's basically what he conveyed during this conference. I did think it was fascinating, though, to hear him basically take this idea about will neutral rates rise and just throw it aside. Just didn't care at all about that. So I did think that was very interesting. He also says that we are probably at sufficiently restrictive levels. This is pretty key. Both of these things actually somewhat bullish, suggesting that Jerome Powell is aware of that two-sidedness of Fed policy. On one hand, suggesting, hey, look, you know, maybe savings created more of a lag, and therefore we've been structurally resistant to higher interest rates. But as we kind of watch, we want to make sure we don't go too far. That was yet another bullish thing that he said, because previously he said, well, if we go too far, we could just cut. Now he's saying, quote, we don't want to go too far. Rates are probably sufficiently restrictive. We have a mandate for an equal outcome between max employment and price stability. These were definitely softeners to his initial response of, we have a long way to go, and, you know, monetary policy might have to do the rest of the work since supply chains have done their work and now there's the rest to do. So we'll see. Personally, my takeaway on this is patience. This process is taking a whole lot longer than anybody thought it would take, and it's probably going to continue taking a whole lot longer. I think patience is really important in this sort of environment, and not to be reckless and to minimize your potential risk for any kind of loss. I do think there's a cycle of probably tax loss harvesting that's going to happen between the next 5 weeks here as we get into the close of the year. There's about 7 weeks left in the year, but buckle up. I think we're going to get through it. I strongly believe in the long term, the Nike swoosh will be accurate. And I don't think we're going to revisit the lows of last year. Knock on wood. The news, this positioning from Jerome Powell and the Fed is not horribly bearish. Jerome Powell could have been substantially more bearish here. Of course, his initial comments did drive up yields. So you've definitely got some fluctuation here, especially since you had Ken Griffin come out this morning, really echo the ideas of deglobalization, which Ken Rogoff talked about. And his take is, hey, look, everybody's trying to deglobalize. That's going to leave rates higher for the rest of the decade. That was Kenny G this morning. Rogoff kind of echoed that. I've always called this reglobalization, which is a shifting and rebuilding of supply chains, but not necessarily deglobalization. Then again, who knows? A lot of uncertainty. And like Ken Rogoff said in this conference, this is probably one of the most uncertain times that we have seen in decades. And it kind of made me think there for a moment, wow, like when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the housing crisis was occurring, it was kind of like, all right, we know we're effed, and everything goes to crap. And it's like your classic kind of recession. The Fed has to come in and bail everyone out February of 2009, and the pain is over, right? So it's kind of like you have this 9-month period of pain. Now, we've actually been at it longer than 2008. If you think about it, we've had Jerome Powell creating pain since Q4 of 2021, December of 2021. We're coming up on 2 years of a painful market. 2 freaking years, man. And nobody knows when it's going to come to an end, because it's not clear that the Fed can just come bail us out, because then you have the risk of, inflation again. So, I mean, even the IMF individual who was speaking here, she suggested that stagflation is a scenario that cannot be ruled out, and that is highly atypical to have a slowdown in inflation occurring without a significant blow to the labor market. But because of that, we can basically keep rates higher for longer. So kind of wild to think about those things. Now, if we look at the 10-2 to look at the yield curve, you've got, just to clarify that, what's wild is how long this pain has been going on, right? That's the wild part. And it's like, when's it going to end? And people are like, I don't know, maybe March, maybe January, maybe May, maybe the end of next year. Who knows? Maybe we'll be in a recession. There's a lot of fear. Right now, rate cuts only being priced into about 4.6% by the end of next year, which is like nothing. It's like 75 bips of a rate cut. Not pricing in any more rate increases. That Fed term rate capped out at 5.35, 5.375 puts us at max. So we're really not expecting anything here. And I think the only thing oil, fortunately, under $80, that's great. Gold retreated again a little bit. I think the only thing that we could say with certainty, is that the price of the course is going up Friday night. So you got any questions, send us an email. Send us an email over at staff@meetkevin.com. We can help you out. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go through the rest of the Elon pod, and I'll probably post a video of some of just my clips of it. So with that said, even though I'm a licensed financial advisor, licensed real estate broker, and becoming a stockbroker, this video is neither personalized financial nor real estate advice for you. It is also not tax, legal, or otherwise personalized advice for you. This video provides generalized perspective, information, and commentary. Third-party content shall not be deemed endorsed by me and shall not be deemed reasonably sufficient for the purpose of evaluating security. Personally operate an ETF and am not related to any issuers or market makers. And any kind of links might be things that lead to us making money. Duh. See ya.